Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
Reading about these family tragedies, I did feel remarkably connected to them because I felt so devastated finding out about those losses.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app so that you don't miss out on future episodes. In the tense years of the early Cold War, American and Soviet women conducted remarkable penpal correspondence that enabled them to see each other as friends rather than enemies. In a compelling new perspective on the early Cold War, prize-winning historian Alexis Perry's new book, Dear Unknown Friend, explores correspondence between American and Soviet women begun in the last years of World War II and continuing into the 1950s. The women's letters movingly demonstrate the power of the personal. I'm delighted to welcome Alexis Perry to our Cold War conversation.
Well, I came by the topic quite by accident, but I had been working a lot on the Second World War, and I did a first book about the siege of Leningrad. And I was very excited to write a second book that would be about the rebuilding of the Soviet Union primarily by Soviet women, since Soviet women and German POWs were the two major able-bodied adult populations that rebuilt the USSR after the war. And so I started researching that in the Russian state archives and ordered some files about various women's groups. And that's when I stumbled upon these letters and was really surprised to see them. I didn't know how extensive this project was, so I ordered a couple more files and a couple more and found a few letters stashed here and there. And then soon I discovered that there were thousands of letters just between Soviet and American women, but also thousands of letters between British women and Soviet women, later German women, French women, etc. And then it became, such a fascinating body of documents and such an extensive one that I thought, okay, I'm going to stop my original plan and I'm going to focus on these letters. And they really just drew me in. So I kind of came by the topic quite by accident.
Serendipity. We like serendipity in terms of just coming across stuff like that. Now, these women were effectively what I know as pen pals. Now, how was the practice of pen pals viewed at the time? Was it a common practice?
It was fairly common, especially in the United States and Western Europe, and somewhat common in the Soviet Union, although much more limited. So pen pals as an international kind of phenomenon, the idea that you would have a correspondent overseas who you may or may not ever meet, but write to regularly. This is something that really comes about at the late 19th century. There are various laws that get passed. There's a sort of an international postage rate, flat postage rate that comes in that many countries sign on to, and a couple other laws that make this feasible for everyday people to carry on correspondence with someone far away. And then in the early 20th century, it really takes off in Europe and also in the United States. In the interwar period, it becomes something that a lot of Americans do. Many religious groups do it as part of their proselytization work or their missionary work, and also children really start to do it. So it's in the early 20th century is a time when pen friendship also becomes associated with something like a youth activity. And Russia is part of those, although once the Russian Empire collapses and the Soviet Union is founded in the early 20th century, they're very much restrict who can send letters overseas and what contacts Soviet citizens can have overseas. And the typical international correspondence that was allowed was between Soviet citizens who were either in the party or were in the communist youth organization, or who were really they were called heroes of labor, so like exemplary workers. And then they would connect with people who were like-minded overseas. So, for example, members of the Socialist Party in Germany and Britain and so forth. And those were the kinds of pen friendships that were allowed. They were closely monitored, and they were really for strategic purposes. So what's so interesting, or to me, about this particular pen friendship program that starts during World War II is that it's a very different group of correspondents who are allowed to write. First of all, they're women, which is really unusual and surprising. even given the Soviet Union's kind of radical gender equality policies, is still very unusual to ask women to take the lead as kind of being the face of the nation during a time of war. And then on top of that, the women that they recruited and asked to do this were not party members. They were not political elites. They were not well connected. They weren't heroes of labor. So there was a real ordinariness about them that during the war, the regime recognized was of real value. That if we connect, apparently typical or ordinary people with people overseas, then they'll be able to identify with each other in a way that they wouldn't if this person was somehow illustrious in their professional achievements or otherwise.
So the Soviet Union initiates this exchange of letters. What are their motives? Is it primarily for propaganda purposes?
It is. It's strategic. They do initiate it, which is also interesting. There's a lot of stereotypes in American academia in particular that sort of the United States came up with these sort of citizen diplomacy programs, and that's just simply not true. And this is one example of that. The Soviet Union comes up with it, and it is very strategic from the start. Their goal is to get the Western allies much more heavily involved in the Eastern Front. And specifically, they want more weapons. They want a second front opened in Europe. So they want ground troops, American, Canadian, British, etc., ground troops invading on land and fighting in Europe against the Nazis. And they want women of the United States, of Britain, France, etc., to rally their governments into giving more support to the Eastern Front. So that's really the goal. And that's very apparent from the start. But what's so fascinating is that the letter writers really don't write about those issues. They hardly ever make a request. There are 2 letters that I found that are very explicit saying, send more guns and send more bombs. But for the most part, the letter writers don't do that. Instead, they really focused on, that is the Soviet letter writers, they really focused on connecting with the woman they imagined would receive their letter. And they do rally them into the war effort, but more by telling these stories about their experiences, about living under occupation, or about losing their husbands or their sons, or losing their parents. There's some very powerful letters about women who were incarcerated in Jewish ghettos in zones of occupation. And that's really how they make this connection with their ally, is they turn towards the personal and they turn towards the emotional, instead of these sort of really practical demands for support, material support. So even though the official goal is strategic, the organization that runs this on the Soviet side and also the Communist Party, they sort of allow women to go off script. Again, really unusual for the Soviet Union, and particularly in times of war. But the war is a little bit of an exceptional time in the USSR, where this really strong control over many details of human contact is necessarily suspended because of the chaos and because of the extremity of the situation. Some scholars have called it a time of spontaneous de-Stalinization, because the party simply couldn't keep control over everything as effectively. And so there are these very cool moments where human contact is allowed to a much greater degree than before, out of necessity, and also because there are these opportunities created by the chaos.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that they choose women to initiate this exchange. I mean, the Soviet view, and again, it's this patronizing view of women that is during this period. They've got this thought, and I think this is the same from the US side as well, is that, well, they won't have any secrets to give away to
Yes.
to the other side.
That's exactly right. And one of the, I wouldn't quite say delightful, maybe that's too strong of the word, but one of the really intriguing parts of doing this work was that some of the biggest similarities in mentality I saw were between the White House and the Kremlin, or the State Department and the Kremlin. The sort of logic that both sides were using was really, really similar. So yes, they thought there are lots of stereotypes that they both employ, that, well, women are good at making friends and women are sort of amiable and agreeable, and they'll put this friendly face on the nation. And then if they don't, no big deal, that they can't, as you say, divulge any state secrets. They're not really that important, in a kind of political sense. So if we lose a couple women, oh well. But men were expressly forbidden from writing. In the Soviet case, they weren't initially. It's just that the women's organization that ran this, it was one of several anti-fascist committees, all of which were aimed at rallying Western support. And the other committees were better funded. They were also male dominated. And they sent emissaries, they sent representatives from the Soviet Union to the United States, to Britain, to fundraise in person. But the Women's Committee and the Children's Committee didn't have that kind of budget. So they made recourse to correspondence instead. And as it turned out, the correspondence ended up lasting much longer than those in-person exchanges. And then the Women's and the Children's Committee actually outlasted any of the other anti-fascist committees by many, many years. So it had this staying power, but it came from a place of disadvantage, and it kind of came from a place of marginalization. And in terms of the State Department, they just said, we're not letting our men do this. They thought it was dangerous, especially because the Soviet Union was inviting American GIs to correspond if they wanted. And so they just made a rule that it would only be women who could do it.
And how quickly did the US and the Brits sort of respond to this Soviet initiative? Because this came pretty much from the blue, I would have thought, too.
Yes, it did. So very different stories. And I spent a good deal of time reading British women's letters, too. Soviet women initiate this in both cases, and the British response is quick and it's very strong. So when they begin, Soviet Union begins this in 1941, the fall of 1941, they instantly, almost within weeks, get hundreds and hundreds, and then eventually tens of thousands of letters from British citizens. Not all of them women, but many, many of them women. And they show up to the embassies and the consulates. Some are just simply sent across the border. And this huge body of British letters exists in the archives. And there's a very quick sense of solidarity that gets expressed. There's a real quick meeting of the minds where British women, for example, understand when Soviet women write about bombardment, or they write about rationing, or they write about the loss of their husbands and their sons and so forth. So there's a connection that forms there really quickly. And some of the more interesting British and Soviet correspondences have to do with women who've recently entered munitions jobs or traditionally male jobs, and they're probe Soviet women with questions about, like, how do we organize for better wages? Or how do we unionize? Or how did you manage sort of social concerns like childcare and breastfeeding and all of that? Like, they really want the nuts and bolts of sort of how did you integrate women in the workplace? How do you create a social welfare state, right? Which we know, of course, Britain then moves towards that to a degree after the war. American letters is a total different story. Soviet women write and write and write, and they get no response. There's no interest expressed on the American side for years. And the only thing that changes that between 1941 and 1943, when they get responses, is the Battle of Stalingrad. And there are many aspects of the Red Army's war performance that gets celebrated in the American press. But the Battle of Stalingrad is sort of a major turning point. And so by, early 1943, the American press, Time magazine, Look magazine, Life magazine, they're covered with these spreads about our heroic Soviet ally and the great victory at Stalingrad. And then at that point, American women start writing, and they start writing in big numbers, and then it never stops. In fact, the Soviet group after that tries several times to stop the Correspondence project, but they constantly get letters from the United States, and they can't stem the tide of those letters. So it's a really interesting story where once American women become interested and and know about this opportunity, they run with it. Even though it's Soviet initiated, it's sort of perpetuated by American energy.
How are the correspondence matched up? How do the Soviets decide who's going to respond to so-and-so in Iowa?
Yes, well, it's an interesting story. So initially, the war letters are very interesting. Some of them contain very specific requests. by the letter writers about who they want to be paired with, almost to the point of reading like personal ads. Some of them will say, like, in the salutation, they'll say something like, to the wife of a soldier who's has 2 children and is working in a factory job. And those salutations are really versions of themselves. It's really self-descriptions, and they want to find someone with whom they can identify. But those are very difficult to pair up, because even though there are many American women who entered factories, whose husbands were deployed overseas, those did not tend to be the American women who wrote in this project. The group is not representative of the population as a whole. So the American women who tended to write tended to be middle class and upper class. They tended to do sort of volunteer and civic work instead of doing factory jobs, for example. And so they weren't able to totally identify in that way. So you can see on the Soviet side, the organization that ran it sometimes would alter salutations for the pairings. So I saw a number of Soviet letters that were addressed to a woman worker, and then that was crossed out by the organization facilitating this, and instead they wrote in to a mother. So they tried to find ways of matching people where there was common ground, and they made adjustments accordingly. Similarly, there was a 17-year-old girl whose village was occupied by the Germans, who escaped and became an orphan. And she requests another 17-year-old girl in the United States. Well, they don't have one that's writing, so they match her with a woman who has a 17-year-old son. So there's some efforts to find compatibility. But Soviet women are clearly being told you're going to be matched with someone who does your job. And you can really see the Soviet belief that work is the basis of identity. So they figure, well, if they're doing the same job, then they'll have an instant connection. But again, both during the war and after, American women aren't doing the same jobs as Soviet women. They don't have the opportunities in many cases. So after the war, you get a lot of Soviet women who are professionals, lawyers, teachers, chemists, physicians, physicists, etc. And they all expect to be matched with an American women doing their same job. So they write these salutations that say things like, "Dear American female doctor," or something like that. And then they end up getting paired with women whose husbands are doctors in the United States. So this idea of matching already shows how different Soviet and American women's lives are. But they still try to look for places of common ground or compatibility, even so.
Yeah, I found it interesting because in some of the US letters are talking about their house and their fantastic household appliances that they've got and stuff like that, not sort of realizing what state the Soviet Union is at this point, and the conditions there. And with the Soviet women, they're talking about the fantastic childcare they get, whereas in fact the reality is somewhat different to that. So they are propagandizing to some degree there, and there's this sort of like disconnect between these two sides.
There's a real strong disconnect that comes across very, very immediately in the letters. So what's really interesting is how they do find enough common ground that sustains a pen friendship for 5, 6, 7 years, because on the face of it, their lives are really different. And as you say, both sides are propagandizing. The Soviet side most obviously and most explicitly, but the American side as well. Even though the Americans are not being instructed to do this, both sets of letter writers try to put their best foot forward, and they try to put this very positive spin on their nation and their way of life. Whether or not they're being prompted to do that, they both do that. So they both give a bit of a rosy picture that begins to degrade over time. But yes, the Soviet women, they're living in abject poverty across the board. And what they have is their education, and they have their professions, and they're fiercely proud of those things. But what they conceal is that, they're not just working because they love their jobs. They're working because they are the breadwinners, because they're widows, because they're desperate to feed their children, for example. And American women you can get this sense that they have come out of the Depression. They're riding this wave of American post-war prosperity. They're fiercely proud of their appliances, as you say. They're very detailed about the square footage of their homes or the upholstery that they have. And they go into great detail about that, I think with the intention of saying, oh, if you can picture me in my home, that will help us to really connect. But how that reads to someone who's impoverished, of course, it comes across as a sort of classic example of American materialism and so forth. And so you see the ways that they present very differently, Soviet American women, but they also work to see past those differences. It's what's really remarkable is that none of the Soviet women write back and say, I find it really obnoxious that you spend all this time talking about how well off you are. They don't do that. And American women don't write and say, wouldn't it be much nicer if you didn't have to work all these hours and you had a husband who went to work for you, and then you wouldn't be, so exhausted all the time. And they could have made those moves easily. And those are the moves that are being made in the press. Those are the things their politicians are saying. But instead, they try to keep the conversation going and sort of live with each other's truth for a while and try to see things from each other's perspective. And I think that above all is what kept this project really interesting for me, because a deal of propagandizing is to be expected, and that's not particularly interesting or surprising. But the moments where they don't go for the jugular, when they don't just play the familiar move, when American women don't attack the Soviet Union as being a police state, and Soviet women don't talk about Jim Crow and racial segregation in the United States, those would have been really easy moves to make. And instead, they raise those things as issues, but not combatively. They raise it as a talking point without just sort of being mouthpieces of their politicians. So it's an attempt to have real exchange of ideas and discourse, but that doesn't sort of devolve into just sloganeer or combative politics.
Yeah, because I think what you see is that they go towards something that will be common no matter where you were in the world. So they talk about motherhood and
yes,
educational opportunities, childcare, and they try and link on those levels. And I found it really interesting, that the some of them are really avidly wanting to hear about the progress of the other one's children and
yes,
and things like how are they getting on at school, and they're lovely the communications that are going on.
It is lovely. Well, first, it's as a 21st century person, it's lovely to read letters that are written with such care and detail, and not by people who are in a rush, who are shooting off 20 different emails. But yes, the kind of investment in relationship is really striking. And, for all of the promotion of national ideals, there's also this sense of that comes across anyways, real sincere interest in each other and each other's well-being. And that's what I think keeps them writing year after year, is they're genuinely interested in how the other is doing. And they certainly debate and disagree, but that doesn't mean that doesn't preclude them from expressing appreciation for each other and care and concern. And, I worked on this project during this period when I feel like, American politics have become incredibly polarized. Many international political relationships have become that way. Certainly, Russian-U.S. relations have really deteriorated. There's a real unwillingness of either side to listen or to try to identify or understand. And as I said, within the United States, that's very apparent from our political landscape. And so to watch people who are living during this incredibly divisive time, not unlike our own, make a different choice in how they're going to communicate and how they're going to connect, that was really remarkable to see. And it was something that I came away with great admiration for that. Because as I said, it would be easy to make the combative move, but that, of course, would spoil the friendship. So they try to find other ways to talk about things that matter, that aren't going to be, relationship ending.
Yeah, they value the friendship over the ideology.
Yeah.
Angle there. Were these letters censored in any way?
Yes, they were definitely censored and they were monitored. The Soviet group that ran this, called the Soviet Women's Anti-Fascist Committee, they did all the translation from English to Russian and Russian to English. And for the other correspondences, they did the translation as well, German, French, etc. And they also had their censors look at the letters. And in the archives, you can see all the versions in many cases. So you can see the original letter, you can see a translated version, you can see a censored version, and then you can see the version that they sent. So it's really interesting to check that out. But for the most part, the Soviet censorship is very light, surprisingly light. Mostly what they edited were sometimes factual errors. Sometimes there's one letter writer who talks at length about the Soviet tax code, which is just all over the place and totally incorrect, and they just they just take it out. They also, interestingly, the censors sometimes add in footnotes to explain things. So, for example, there's a Soviet woman who says, I studied at such and such an institute. And then there's a little inserted asterisk and a footnote at the bottom that says, this means that she has a college degree. So the censor comes in to try to explain, or in some cases sort of enhance the credentials of the writer. But the censorship was pretty light. I think what I would say instead is that the self-censorship in both groups of letters is fairly strong. There are many obvious omissions. There are many women who write with pseudonyms, and it took me a while to figure that out, but some write with pseudonyms. Many conceal things about their backgrounds, relatives' names, and so forth. And some don't use their addresses. So there's certainly a way that both sets of letter writers are being careful. And after a time, I mean, Soviet women always know that their letters are being read. But American women, after a time, also realize that their letters are being read and then become more careful at that point on.
Yeah, we'll come on to that in a moment. Now, I think I read in the book that when an American woman would receive the letter, they'd also receive the handwritten Russian letter and the translation. And I think there was at least one situation where somebody had actually got the Russian version translated and found that it was different to what the Soviets had sent over as the translation.
Yes, well, they did get the handwritten, and then they would get a translation. There were several women in the United States who said, I'm going to have this checked. So they took it to an acquaintance or often a member of their church congregations who were Russian speakers and would check it. But actually, most of those said the translations were accurate. So they were pretty good, and I checked them as well. There were a couple things that stumbled translators. I found actually more mistakes with the British letters than the American. There are certain British phrases that somehow stymied, I don't know exactly why, but stymied Soviet translators. So cheerio was very difficult to translate. Also, the phrase goodbye for the present, for some reason, really confused translators. So they translated present as gift instead of present as the present moment. And so I noticed, especially with the British letters, that there were a number of mistakes. And in the American case, I didn't see any instances of sort of gross manipulation of what the writer intended. So that was interesting to see. But again, Soviet women knew they were part of an official campaign, and so they were very careful about what they included and didn't include.
As we move into the Cold War period, how does the tenor and tone of these correspondences change when they sort of move from allies to frenemies?
Yeah. Well, it changes. There's a kind of anxiety that enters into the letters. There's a kind of reveling in the alliance during the war. And after the war, the initial letters in 1945 are pretty optimistic that the United States and Soviet Union are going to maintain this political partnership and sort of co-govern along with Britain and other countries, the post-war world. And of course, it becomes apparent right away that that's not the case. And so you can feel this anxiety that emerges in the letters very quickly by 1946 for sure, that this relationship is crumbling and misunderstandings, stereotypes, and miscommunications are abounding between the United States and the Soviet Union. And that gives the letter writing this added impetus that maybe it would have lost once the victory had been achieved in 1945. Also, what changes is the populations of women who write. In the United States, the initial group that writes right after the war tend to be women from very small towns, from religious communities in particular, who are writing from a sense of kind of charity. Many offer gifts or aid, and it's a kind of much more of a sort of spiritual mission that they're on to connect with Soviet women. But as you get to the late 40s, that population shifts to be women who are much more politically progressive, women who are opposed to the Truman administration, women who might describe themselves as Roosevelt Democrats, so that they were part of this popular front during the war, and much more left-leaning. So that they have a different agenda, which is really to kind of push against Cold War propaganda in their own country, and they feel a little bit under siege by that. So that also changes the way that the letters read. Once you get women who are further to the left and sort of more out of alignment with the consensus politics of their own government. Soviet women never do or can express real opposition to their own government's politics. But what creeps in a lot in their letters is that ways in which they make personal life choices, for example, that depart from official ideological principles. But American women become quite outspoken against their own government and the kind of Cold War consensus that becomes dominant.
Can you just expand on that personal life choices comment that you just said about the Soviet women and diverging from the expected norm in the Soviet Union?
Yes, absolutely. So there are a number of times where Soviet women promote social policies, for example, and then make it clear that actually they don't adhere to those things at all. So one of the places I saw this most frequently is for Soviet women to promote universal and subsidized childcare, especially for working mothers, and said, well, women in our country work and they send their children to childcare, and the children do better there than if they were raised by their own parents. Some of the letters contain that claim. And then they'll say, but of course, I don't send my children to a state-subsidized childcare. I'd much rather have my mother watch my children. There are moments like this that kind of creep in, and not within the same letter necessarily, but over the course of several letters, where if you're following the conversation, you can see these departures that a censor wouldn't pick up on necessarily, because they're looking from letter to letter, and they're not comparing previous iterations. There's a couple other things where, especially during the war letters, Soviet women write a lot about sexism in the workplace and preferential hiring for men, for example, after the war, or wage disparities. And those are also the same women whose earlier letters said things like, the Soviet Union, all men and women are paid equally. We believe men and women are equal, and it's written into our Constitution. So you read that letter, and then you read several letters later where their stories of struggle and triumph make it clear that, of course, that may be what the law says, but that's not the practice within the country. So if you're following closely, you can see these clear departures, or these sort of admissions that things are not as ideal as these, propagandistic letters are making it sound. But American women, it's different. American women will say things like, I don't agree with the current president or the current politics. And they're much more open about that. But they become careful, and a couple of them begin to write these asides of things like, for whoever else is reading this, I want you to know that I'm a patriotic American, even though I don't agree with President Truman or President Eisenhower. So they kind of have a political awakening, American women, at least these American women who don't seem particularly savvy to begin with, really become aware that their own governments are reading what they're sending, and that they have to be cautious. And of course, the McCarthy era and the McCarthy hearings make that abundantly clear.
So does the government try and stop this correspondence, or is it purely that there's pressure because of the atmosphere in the US at the time to not have a communist pen pal?
Right. Well, I mean, it's trendy to have one during the war, and then very quickly it becomes a major political risk, right? Very quickly, this project falls afoul of both governments. What's interesting is they both attempt to cancel it several times, and then kind of waver and waffle and allow it to continue. So on the Soviet side, they try to cancel it right in 1945 because they figure war's over. We don't need to do this anymore. There's no point in these letters. And in that case, the party conversation is just that, well, we keep getting so many letters from the United States. Maybe we should do something about that. Maybe we should respond. Maybe we can use this as an opportunity. So they try to cancel then. The United States, there are several points when they also intervene to say, enough is enough. We're not going to do this anymore. And the first time is in the same period of time as 1945, 1946. And what's interesting there is that the Soviet group switches really to using diplomatic couriers to get the letters back and forth, which is rather clever and is a way of working around the attempt of the United States to restrict it, which is by creating postal restrictions. So they get around that. But in the case of the United States, and I'm thinking specifically of the State Department and the FBI correspondence, they decide that this is, again, strategically potentially useful, that some of these Soviet letters might contain useful intelligence. And also, wouldn't it be a good idea for us to keep an eye on American citizens who are, dabbling in socialism or interested in socialism? So the FBI and letters from J. Edgar Hoover in particular indicate that they think it's actually better to allow this to continue and infiltrate, for example, the organization in the United States that runs it, rather than to dispense with it altogether. So again, the thinking is pretty similar on both sides. The Soviet Union, the Central Committee of the Communist Party, tries to cancel it again in 1951. And that's because they just decide this is a waste of resources. They audit the program and they see that, Soviet women are not actually promoting our policies or promoting our initiatives nearly as well as they should. And instead, all these women are talking, as you said earlier, about their children or their jobs or their favorite books. Like, how is this helping us? And so the Central Committee of the Communist Party decides like this is a waste of resources. So they really slash the program down in 1951. But then again, they get so many letters, they just keep coming and keep coming, that eventually they decide, we'll maintain this, we'll keep doing this. But it's interesting that while both governments could have clearly just shut it down if they really wanted to, they're ambivalent about it. And they keep coming back to this idea of, well, perhaps citizen diplomacy really can serve us, or maybe this is useful for intelligence. And so the program gains this momentum and it keeps going despite all of this official government opposition.
Do you find any evidence of the Soviet intelligence services looking at this stuff? Because I guess, you've got somebody working in a munitions factory and they are sympathetic to the Soviet Union. Potentially there's an opportunity there for them.
Yes, that's definitely the overall motivator to keep the project going. And the women of the Soviet Anti-Fascist Committee, the one that runs this group, that's also what they tell the Communist Party. They're sort of handlers in the Central Committee of the Communist Party, is that we're creating these connections, we're promoting socialism to women abroad who are sympathetic. But in the actual execution, the story is much more complicated. So again, I looked at the British and the French cases. In those cases, the Soviet organization really makes an effort to match women in the Soviet Union who are part of the Communist Party and active in the party with British women and French women who are also identifying as socialists and communists. And there, it's a much more explicit kind of attempt at political networking and connection. They list in their records where all these women are from and also if they have a party affiliation or not. And in the French and the British case, they do, by and large. In the American case, they don't. And they continue to use Soviet women who are not members of the Communist Party to write to American women. And also the American women to whom they're writing are not members of communist or socialist parties either. Sometimes their husbands are, or sometimes they move in leftist circles. They're kind of fellow travelers. But the women's organization has this more kind of nuanced view of who are the constituencies in which countries and what kinds of political networking can we do or can't we do. But when they report back to the Central Committee of the Communist Party, they just say, oh, yeah, we're connecting with socialists all over, and we're connecting socialists with socialists. But it's a little bit more variable when you look at the individual correspondences, variable across countries.
How long did it take to get a reply to a letter. You know, we're used to emails pinging backwards and forwards, but I imagine this is possibly weeks and months before you may hear back, and you may not hear back at all.
That's right. So during the war, it took many, many months, sometimes 6 or 7 months to get a reply. The fastest time I saw, the fastest turnaround was about a month. And a typical turnaround was maybe 3 months. And then, of course, someone has to respond right away for it to be a regular correspondence of every couple of months. So what you see is many, many women start to make this pact that they will keep writing even if they haven't yet received a letter back, so that the flow of letters keeps going. And many, many do that. And then, of course, in these long silences and gaps, there are all kinds of worries and anxieties about why that's the case. So you see these frantic letters written back and forth on both sides. I mean, saying things like, I haven't heard from you. What's wrong? You know, are you ill? Did I say something offensive? Or, you know, is your government preventing you from writing? You see all of that very explicitly. And they start to use the term Cold War, first lowercase and in quotes. Maybe that might be interesting to your listeners, not in capital letters as a proper noun, but sort of a Cold War in quotes. So you'll see letters say things like, I haven't heard from you in a while. Maybe it's because of this Cold War our governments are waging, etc. And so the silences also create a great deal of concern because, of course, a pen friendship is only as strong as this commitment to keep it going. And so it's heartbreaking in 1951 when the Soviet Union slashes the program to Britain, France, and the United States. There are lots of American and British letters that say, I don't know what happened. My pen friend just disappeared and I got no explanation of why she disappeared and so forth. And those are quite sad letters to read. But in general, they waited. They waited anywhere between 1 and 6 and 7 months to get a reply.
Wow. There's lots of detail in this book, and obviously we're just whizzing through the sort of excerpts from it. But I think there's a number of sort of pen pal pairs where you dig into quite a lot of detail into their lives and their correspondence. Are there a couple of favorites that you could share with me?
Sure. I think one of my favorites would be Jean Wolfe and her partner, Ekaterina Andreeva. I talk about them a lot, I think, in chapter 4. And they're an interesting pair in part because they write for about 7 years. They send about 3 or 4 dozen letters. So they are very committed. And they're also interesting in a number of respects, partly because the initial interest, I should back up and say that Andreeva is an interesting character. Andreeva is not her name. It's a pseudonym that she uses. She also works for the Soviet Women's Anti-Fascist Committee as a translator. So she's really on the inside. And she starts off translating letters between Jean Wolfe and a different Soviet pen pal. And Jean Wolfe is from Manhattan, Kansas. And Andreeva, the Soviet one, finds their pen friendship so interesting. And in particular, she finds this photograph of Wolfe's 16-year-old son, Don, so charming that she just kind of elbows her way into the correspondence and says, I want to be your correspondent too. I'm so intrigued by your son, Don. She says something like, what a handsome all-American boy, you know? And then she says, I have a niece, and she's the same age, and maybe they'd like to correspond. Or I have another one, you know, she said, it's almost like a blind date. She says, I have one niece who's a brunette and another who's a blonde. And so Don can choose who he wants to write to. And they set up their children or their relations with each other to write as well. And this is not that unusual that a whole family would write together. And then they just become so attracted to each other, these two women. They talk a lot about their favorite books. They talk a lot about movies and so forth that they have in common. But what I think was so interesting is that they really also encourage various life changes in each other in this way that's really positive. A really kind of telling moment was one where Jean Wolfe, whose husband is an academic at Kansas State University, she's a mother of 2. She's a typical faculty wife in that she hosts many events for her husband, and she's involved in the League of Women Voters and her church group. She teaches Sunday school. She also helps her husband write several of his books, only some of which for which she was credited as an author. She writes to her Soviet pen pal and says, look, like, I'm exhausted. I'm doing all the housework. I'm doing my own part-time job as a journalist at our town newspaper. I'm raising two boys and I'm helping my husband's career. And I don't think I can do all of this anymore. I'm going to quit my job as a reporter. And the Soviet pen pal, and Katerina Andreeva, writes back and says, oh, please don't do that, right? Like, this is such an important part of your life and your job. And I'm sure your articles are really good. And isn't there a way that you could manage to keep your job and so forth? And it's done in this way, again, doesn't feel like bullying, and it's not in a superior way. She doesn't say like, well, I can do both, but it's really encouraging. And then Woolf does. She keeps her job. And as I trace their lives going forward after they stop corresponding, Woolf ends up making some dramatic life changes. She ends up divorcing and getting a PhD and becoming a psychologist. And so many of the things that she's interviewed, and so many of the things she tells her clients are things that echo very closely to what she heard and read in her letters from Andreeva. And I think that made this pair really interesting. And I saw that in a lot of cases, is that women, after they stopped corresponding, often made some very dramatic life changes, and often those life changes aligned with advice given by a pen friend. And I'm not saying that Woolf sort of got a divorce because her pen friend told her to or anything like that, but that there's a power of conversations and the influence of relationships, and that this was certainly one of those relationships, one of those influences in Woolf's life that led her to make some pretty strong changes to her in her path. But again, the level of detail at which these women write, the way that they pour into some of their favorite topics and that they encourage their own children, that was really remarkable, I think, to see. And it kept me on the hook reading their letters over the course of about a 7-year period.
I can imagine you just feel really involved with these people because you know they're revealing a lot of their own personality and their heart. I think there's I can't remember the quote. It's something of like the head.
Yes, it's Verena Kohler, I think, and she's a department store clerk in Detroit, and she says that it's the heart and not the head that is the main source of our actions. Yeah. It's a lovely, lovely line there. I mean, did you meet with any of the descendants of these people, and were they aware of this correspondence? Yes, I met with as many as I could. Unfortunately, it was very lopsided. I was able to find many more American descendants than Russian descendants. I should say Soviet descendants, except almost all of the women who wrote were Russians, so Russian descendants. And that's due to a number of things, which I'm happy to talk about. But that was disappointing for me. I wish I had connected with more. But the American descendants with whom I connected were terrific to talk to. First of all, none of them knew that this correspondence existed. So this was not something shared within families after a certain point. They didn't have the letters. I was hoping initially when I met them, very selfishly, that they might have additional letters or copies of the letters, but they didn't. And their mothers and their grandmothers hadn't told them about their participation in this program. So the first thing I did was send them all the letters that I had found and wait for their response. And the way most of them responded was to say, this is a whole different side of my mom or my grandmother or my aunt, but this also rings very true with who I knew them to be. And some of them, of course, were very small children or weren't born yet when their mothers carried on these correspondences. So I think they really enjoyed learning about some of these sides of their moms and grandmothers. And then I, of course, bombarded them with questions about their families to get the end of some of these storylines that carry on during the correspondence. And I've been able to make a couple of public appearances in the United States. And when possible, the descendants of the letter writers have come and spoken as well. And that's been really powerful. I think listening to them speak for my audiences is much greater of a treat than hearing me speak. And it just also made this work so real and palpable to me. I have to admit that when I started finding these letters in the archives, one of my biggest fears is that these were all made up, that these were made up people, that there were sort of like two men in a room smoking cigars coming up with like 40 different female personas,
Oh no.
all for the sake of intelligence. I mean, I had to be sure before I decided to write this book that these people actually existed. So I was greatly relieved when I was able to confirm that. Russian women, it was much harder to track them down, in part because the letter writers concealed much more about their identities. So it was harder to use genealogy to find them. Some of the ones that I did find also declined to be interviewed, which is not surprising given the state of US-Russia relations. But on the other hand, some of the Russian women were quite prominent in their professions and in other circles. And so they wrote memoirs, they gave interviews, they had academic publications. So in some cases, I was able to track down a bit more about their lives post-correspondence through other means, unfortunately not through interviews, but through some very interesting memoirs that they published.
Did you get to look at any of the FBI files on any of the US correspondence?
Yes, I spent years doing Freedom of Information Act requests, constant. And I have many outstanding, so if the FBI ever gets to them, maybe I will get to do a second edition or a revised edition. A number of the American women I requested FBI files for, it came back right away that they didn't have them. Some of them do have them, and I'm waiting to receive them. In one or two cases, I did receive FBI files on individuals, but they were people who ran the Penpal group. And there's extensive FBI documentation on the American group that ran this program, and it's called the National Council of American-Soviet Friendship. That group was early on infiltrated by the FBI, monitored very closely. They were indicted numerous times by the House Un-American Activities Committee, and then later various anti-communist initiatives in the Department of Justice, and by the Attorney General's office. Many times, 45, 47, 48, 1954, etc. They were put on trial. And so they have very extensive FBI files. And so I read through those very closely. And that was really interesting to see. But most of the individual women thus far as I can tell, didn't have FBI files. And in part, that's because when the National Council of American-Soviet Friendship was put on trial, the women who ran the Penpal project did this beautiful job of obfuscating and concealing the identity of many of the letter writers. And so those particular women were never arrested or incarcerated for disloyalty. But there were a number of activists who wrote through the Penpal organization, and they were almost all put on trial in their local state, anti-American activities boards, and suffered various consequences because of it.
Why did the writing stop, or what was the latest set of letters that were exchanged between the two countries?
Good question. So I end up ending my book in 1953, which, just as an aside, is generally speaking when studies of U.S.-Soviet citizen diplomacy begins, or it begins in 1956. So generally it starts with the death of Stalin in 1953, or it starts with the Geneva Conference, or it starts with Khrushchev's thaw. So it was sort of fun to write a book on this topic that ended where everyone else starts. But I stop in 53 in part because this is right after the Soviet side has slashed the letter writing program. So there's very few pen pals left. And also many of the letters start disappearing from the archives. So at that point, I couldn't find Soviet letters after 1953. I found the American letters, but I couldn't find the Soviet ones. So I wasn't able to reconstruct the conversation to the same degree as I was before. And so I had to choose that as a stopping place. But the Pen Friendship projects officially continue past 1953. And I found documentation during the Khrushchev-Eisenhower years, 56 and onward, for example, that in fact it grew and expanded because, again, so many folks, particularly in the United States, wanted to correspond. And after Khrushchev begins his thaw, and there's several major events, including the Moscow Youth Festival that's held, there are many Soviet men and women who want international pen pals. So it really takes off. And I want to put in a plug for another historian, Christine Varga Harris, who's based in the United States. She's written numerous articles and is continuing to write about letters from the 1950s and 60s. So it does actually continue on. But the kind of robust American-Soviet exchange that grew out of the war, that really ends in 53. And by the time you get to the mid-50s and 60s, it's a new set of women, a new set of correspondence, and a very different era. This era of open exchange between the two countries, which I think in some ways makes the letter writing seem a little less unique and rather one of many kinds of exchange programs that came to exist between East and West.
When does Gene Wolfe's and Andreeva's correspondence finish?
It ends around 1950, 1951, and that's the time when the program got slashed. But I think the more proximate cause is that Gene Wolfe's younger son is killed in a motorcycle accident that year. And she just sort of uproots her whole life and makes some major life changes. And I think that's really the reason why that correspondence ends as abruptly as it does. You were talking earlier about getting attached to these letter writers, and I definitely did. And I remember how it felt when I saw the news reports that her son had died at such a young age. And then while I was researching the family, I saw a report that her son, Don, also died very prematurely in a terrible cliff diving accident with his son. And then tracing these families and reading about these family tragedies, I did feel remarkably connected to them because I felt so devastated finding out about those losses moving forward. So Wolfe and Andreeva probably would have lost their correspondence because of official decisions, but I think it ended early because of life tragedy, personal tragedy.
The book is full of these touching stories, but I hadn't realised how much I'd be moved by the book. I think that's what surprised me.
I think it's a good reminder, especially in this day and age, that we can really have meaningful conversation with people who don't see eye to eye with us, that we don't have to agree with someone to actually connect with them and feel for them. It seems a little trite to say that, but I feel like, at least speaking for my own country and its political situation, we desperately need those kinds of reminders that you can connect with someone who's living in a world where they are exposed to a lot of disinformation about your way of life, and you can still find common ground and you can still find things to discuss in a meaningful way. So I learned a lot from these letter writers that I didn't expect to.
The book is called Dear Unknown Friend, The Remarkable Correspondence Between American and Soviet Women, and it's by Alexis Perry, who you've just been listening to. It's published by Harvard University Press, and there'll be links in the episode notes to buy the book and support the podcast. The episode extras, such as videos, photos and other content, are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.